Okay, I think we're all being recorded now. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Vermont Climate Council Science and Data Subcommittee for March 24th. I hope everybody's enjoying the pre-spring weather here. We have a full agenda again today. I think that's going to be a theme for this committee. I sent out the agenda to committee members yesterday, I believe. We'll approve the minutes. We have a spot on the agenda for a co-chairs meetings update. As far as I know, that there are no updates there, so we will skip that agenda item. And then really the core of our meeting today will be a discussion on the request for input, summarizing that. There was a document sent out by me yesterday that was largely created by committee member Jared Duvall that myself and Jane discussed with him, and we sent out that summarized the request for input and had some ideas for a request for proposals. We'll have a committee discussion on that, and then discuss a work plan. This morning I've been drafting adding some meat to the milestones that were on the subcommittee scope document previously, and to the extent we have time, we can talk about that document, but we can just talk about the different activities we need to do generally for a work plan. And then, as usual, next meeting, public comment and adjourn. Does anybody have any comments on the agenda? I may add one item, and perhaps we'll do this just before or replace the co-chairs meetings update, because there were no meetings, is to just update on subcommittee membership. We did have that outstanding invite that we could update on and see if there's a discussion around a path forward. So I'm going to propose that be an update to the agenda. And with that, are there any objections or comments on the agenda? Okay. So hearing none, yesterday also sent out the March 17th meeting minutes. And I will open it up for discussion or comment on those minutes. Richard.
Yeah, if the record could please show that I was present for that meeting. I'm not listed among those in attendance, and I was.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the email on that earlier. I did open those up afterwards and noticed that you're not alone, although everybody was kind of mentioned later on in the minutes on the subcommittee members in attendance. Yourself, Lou, and Jay were not listed there, so I think we can amend the minutes to add you all as being present.
Thank you.
Any other comments or discussion on the minutes? Jared?
Also, it may have been a one-time typo, but I did notice that in most places, Leslie Ann's name is spelled correctly, ending in Y, but I think there's one place that we get that correct going forward.
Find and replace.
Right. Any objections to that, Leslie Ann?
Definitely not.
It's looking for you, Leslie.
So I'm having trouble syncing up between my UVM teams and this team, so I'm going to leave my camera off, but I am here.
Great, thank you. And then it looks like Jane, your hand is up.
I just thought maybe since Andrea had noted in our back and forth about the minutes, just like 1 second about since you're rotating minute takers, Andrea did an excellent job last time, but I just wanted to reiterate that like the minutes don't have to be as detailed as they have been, so they don't have to be quite as laborious for folks who take on this job. So really focusing on action items and where consensus was reached. And really referencing and leading in to the video where needed for clarity around discussion. That's
Great.
it.
Thank you, Jane. And just for the record, I asked Bennett to take another turn at taking minutes today. So, and then I guess for the record, the minutes also list Claire McElveny as being in attendance last week, and she was not, so we'll make that change also. Okay, so with those 3 changes, are any objections to approving the minutes? Hearing none, the amended minutes are approved. And so the next item on the agenda, well, let me ask Jane a question. So we just amended the agenda that was drafted, and just for the record, do we need to revise that for what is ultimately posted on the Climate Council website?
It's a good point of clarity. I'm not 100%, but I'll check with Melissa and make sure if it's needed that I'll update it with her.
Okay, thank you. So this item is, as you all will recall, we invited Linda McGinnis to join the subcommittee as a member, and due to personal reasons, she needed to decline, although she's very much supportive of the work and regretted not being able to join us. So I didn't want to lose this thread, and I wanted to just open it up for discussion to the committee. One of the reasons we invited her was because we had identified a gap in kind of the economist type thinking, I guess, or having an economist on the committee. And the question is, do we try and seek out a replacement, and I'll ask a question of Jane if that's still possible given the where the full council is right now, and if not, how do we get that expertise into the committee, which is a question we may not be able to answer right now.
Well, I'll just say that many subcommittees are still, not many, but 2 in particular, are still in flux on membership. And so I think that's totally appropriate. I'll also suggest that Julie, you suggested somebody to me offline that we could reach out to in a staff support capacity for this expertise. And that might be a different role than actually having a member here if that person was willing to step up. So perhaps if you're not able to consider somebody thoroughly, or find somebody, I should say, that's willing to step up in a full membership role, perhaps there's a staff support that I could do some homework on to try to see if that person has capacity.
Jared, go ahead.
Yeah, as I remember reviewing all of the hundreds of nominees, many well qualified, that came in as we were sorting through the subcommittee kind of expansion process. There was only one other nominee who was explicitly identified as an economist and having kind of expertise in economic analysis. And that was Steve Latendra from, I don't actually know if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, from Synapse Energy Economics. And his name came up alongside Linda's when we were having this discussion initially. I will say that I am not sure. I think there's a question because, and I don't think it's inappropriate to say this, it's all public information. Steve responded to, and his organization Synapse responded to the RFI, And so I don't know if it's appropriate to make it, like when it would be appropriate to make a decision regarding him and what kind of considerations would need to go into that. I know that there are other folks on this subcommittee who, if not themselves directly, they're, you know, like the University of Vermont replied to the RFI, and, you know, but that to me, since he, I guess I just am raising the question. I don't know if and how that should factor into our decision making. And I would seek kind of guidance or, you know, insight from state staff around kind of how we legally or appropriately regarding, you know, some of the considerations we have should treat that. I think it's also possible. I like your idea, Jane. I do think that there are some state staff who would have a lot of expertise to add in that area. The first person who comes to mind who's already staffing the cross-sector mitigation, kind of our sibling subcommittee, is Ken Jones, the economic research analyst at the Agency of Commerce, and he would be incredibly helpful to this work, but I don't want that to necessarily preclude the possibility of adding an additional subcommittee member.
As far as conflict of interest, I mean, I guess that's a tricky spot, right? They'll likely respond to the RFP, and we could just sort of go down that path when it happens. I mean, and when and if they were selected for a contract, that would be, they'd have to recuse themselves from any conversations about the RFP if he was on the subcommittee, and then if he was selected, I imagine whoever is selected for that RFP or the folks selected for RFP will have a role in interactions with this committee ongoing. So maybe they're not a member anymore. Maybe they're the contractor in that capacity. My suggestion from process would be that the way the other committees, like rural resilience comes to mind, they're striking out continually with this one branch of expertise that they feel is really critical to their group. They keep going sort of down the list of nominees and haven't looked outside that sort of bracket of folks yet. And so I guess my suggestion would be maybe we consider, or you guys consider now, the two paths. One, working with the one other economist who seemed to come up high on that nominations list, and, you know, consider what that would mean. And then two, if the expertise also, in addition to or separately, should be made available through staff capacity, we could consider the full suite of folks that might be available to provide that. And I'd be happy to work with others on that.
Well, I guess the question to the committee is how strongly we feel we need to move forward and spend time on that now with lots of other priorities. You know, if we'll have discussions on the RFP, but you know, if an economist was part of that consultancy, then, you know, is the need for that perspective captured? And if not, does a state presence help there? And then if not, do we, you know, try and come up with other nominees essentially to reach out to? And I guess my initial thought, and this is very open for discussion, is to just see what we get from the request for proposals and see how that plays out, and make a decision if we need more substantive economist expertise at that time.
TJ, if I may, the expertise in both econometric as well as economist have come up a number of times in a number of different places. And so I think from a totality, a comprehensiveness perspective, having folks at the table as we're discussing all of the elements of what we need to do and how we're going to do it might be the other part of that coin that we can think about, because what I'm trying to avoid is maybe 4 months down the road saying, I wish we had.
Yeah.
Right. And so to the extent that we try and be proactive in that, maybe do a little bit more digging and see if the person or the persons are available and able to join. And if not, then we have the answer, because then it becomes an either or, a binary piece. But I just don't want us to be like, the end of May or the end of July and be like, oh man, we should have been doing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. That's why I put out the perspective to draw out other folks' opinions that may have a little more thought into them. So go ahead, Jared.
It may also be helpful to kind of break this into short or kind of near term and medium term needs. I mean, as I think about the type of perspective and input we would want from somebody who's an economist who has an economic analysis kind of professional expertise, I mean, I think in the next couple of weeks, it's primarily going to be about informing our RFP and then helping us review those responses. And so that, to me, doesn't feel like an appropriate role for somebody who's responded to that RFP. So I'd rather kind of either identify somebody who could play that role in the short term, like a Ken Jones, and then once we figure out what is happening with the RFP and the kind of needs does not necessarily, the kind of assistance we'd be looking for wouldn't necessarily present a conflict of interest, circle back to that question then.
Lou, I saw your hand first.
Yeah, I just want to echo Jared's comment. That seems like a reasonable approach, and just want to add that I think it would probably be a good idea to have somebody experienced with, economics in general, or at least with these firms from the RFI and from the later RFP, just so we can get some perspective on what they're like and what we should expect them to do. What kind of analyses that could be valuable, certainly in the short term and probably in the longer term as well.
Okay, thanks, Lou. Julie.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think that some of the expertise we may be thinking about may actually be held by the contractors once we have them on board. And really what we need is somebody, very much to Lou's point, that's able to sort of gut check that work and ensure that we're getting the types of outputs and outcomes that we need. And so I think there may be people within state government that could help, that just have enough of a background in economics that they would be able to provide that gut check. It's not that we're looking for somebody to do the actual technical work, I believe, and just want to make sure we're making that distinction in the way we talk about the skill set we think we're in need of on the committee.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, and as far as state government goes, I mean, I've managed a number of those contracts that deal with this with Synapse and other firms, and so have a little bit of that, but I'm not a trained economist. And Ken Jones is obviously one who's mentioned, and I'll throw out Riley Allen from the Department of Public Service, also a trained economist, and so there may be those resources we could tap, and both. Well, all three of us are participating in the Climate Council. Okay, so I think the next step there is for Jane and I to reach out to Ken and Riley and perhaps others within state government to see if they can play that role in terms of the RFP and reviewing that portion of the responses of the RFP. Julie, is that your hand old? Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so hearing no objections to that approach, I think we'll do that and let the committee know what we find out. Okay, the next item on the agenda is discussion of the request for input summary and request for proposals. Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. As I said last time, I have a conflict of interest with with a likely bidder, a family member as a principal in the company. So, you know, the deal was that I was not going to participate in the development of the RFP, and I'm going to stick to that. If, however, what you're really doing is talking about the shape of our work and the shape of our eventual plan, and the RFP is sort of an outgrowth of that, I will be very sad to not be able to participate in that discussion. And you know, this is prompted partly by looking at your and Jared's excellent piece that you circulated yesterday, which is about the RFP, but it's also about the shape of our work, I think. So I am going to close down my participation in this meeting while you all discuss this, but I hope that if decisions are made about the shape of our work and the shape of the plan, that we revisit those outside the context of the RFP.
I guess I would ask and defer to others who know more about this, but my question is that necessary right now? If what we're talking about is that kind of latter half of what you were bringing up, Richard, the shape of the work, the type of analysis that we're looking for this committee in service of the council, and we're not discussing specific respondents. I mean, in that memo, I did not specifically, raise up anybody individually. It feels clear to me that if we got to a decision-making point of, as a committee, trying to make a recommendation or a decision about who to hire, then of course that would make sense. But at this stage, it's not clear to me that you do need to drop off. But I would defer to others who know more.
Well, I'm going to propose what I would like to do is I'm going to turn off my microphone and my camera, and I'm going to listen, as would any member of the public, and not take part.
I certainly, Richard, appreciate kind of the high standard you're holding yourself to. I think it's difficult at the front end of the conversation to know where we might need to draw the line. I think that form of participation is great. And if you wanted to offer reflections maybe to the co-chairs afterwards in writing, that would also be another way for you to sort of provide input, but not necessarily have that kind of back and forth engagement and direct influence over the process.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, and I appreciate that, Secretary Moore. The danger would be that a member of the council would push to shape the RFP in such a way that it would favor one or other of the likely applicants. Okay, and I want to very much avoid being in the position of doing that, which is why I'm going to not say anything.
Thank you.
But before we get into it, Jay, you have your hand up.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that along with Leslie Ann, that we had submitted in response to the RFI, and just to publicly have that here stated for the record. And in the same spirit, I would like to just listen, but also in the spirit of a potential response to the RFP, seems like it's the work in our response outside the scope of what's being described here. So very much in spirit of helping to move this along, but with that potential sensitive conflict of interest, I would rather just listen here as well.
Okay, thank you, Jay. And I do echo Secretary Moore what you're saying about the high standard everybody is holding themselves to. I think it speaks a lot for you and your participation in this whole process. I just want to make sure that formally with Jay and Richard kind of sitting this this discussion out, do we have a quorum of the committee remaining to be able to discuss this business? So I'm just looking at the attendee list. And so I think there's 8 members currently of the committee, and with Jared, Secretary Moore, Lou, and myself makes 4. And I'm not sure if the situation that Leslie Ann, if you're also sitting this discussion out for now, is 4 a significant, is a quorum?
So I was trying to get some clarification from Matt Chapman, and I was not able to meet with him. And so I am in a particularly awkward position of being a co-chair of this subcommittee, but also having responded to one section of the RFI. And so without having received further clarification, I probably should do like Jay and turn things off.
I don't.
So-
I guess Secretary Moore, do you know if I mean, how does a quorum rule work when members are not able to participate because of a conflict? I would think that 4 of those 5 then would be a quorum. If you have 3 that have conflicts, they wouldn't count towards the quorum.
I think that would be the case as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that clarification. Then we
And
can,
I'm not sure, we're not voting on anything, right? So the other piece is I'm not sure that there's necessity to have a full quorum or a quorum of those eligible, even because this is just discussion.
yes, although I think we'll be shaping the RFP that's going to be made. So I don't know where the balance is there, but I'm okay. If we have a quorum, it doesn't matter.
Correct.
Okay. So
Oh wait, we actually have an attorney with us, Megan O'Toole. So Megan can speak up about this perhaps, and she's been thinking about this. So go ahead, Megan.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify and agree with the statement that was made regarding voting versus participation and the quorum. It really, I think what it comes down to, and just as an aside, conflict of interest is really something that's determined by the individual member. There's no real rules defining what a conflict of interest is. It's something that in the member's best judgment, they need to, kind of exercise their best judgment regarding their particular conflict and how it might apply to this situation. But really, I think you can count these members as being present and participating. But if you do need to vote on the question, that's where the issue of a quorum and those members recusing themselves, using their own best judgment would come into play. So I hope that's helpful.
thank you, Megan.
Although, just for point of process clarification, the roadmap, the process roadmap that steering committee recommended and the council approved on Monday does note that in the event of a decision that needs to be voted on by a subcommittee, it would just be council members voting. So that then the quorum kind of math would be different than the full subcommittee math.
Right.
But
that's a really good point, Jared. Yeah, it would be.
We're going into a voting situation. We're trying to operate by consensus anyway.
Right. And so hopefully, you know, if we can move, it sounds like we can move forward, that even if everybody was recused and couldn't participate, then we still have a quorum and can move forward. So I'd like to move forward and thank everybody for bearing with that discussion, that process discussion. And I guess I'll still note, just Jay and Richard, I think your hands are still up. Those look like old hands, but if you drop them, I won't call on you while you're trying to be quiet. Okay, so as was noted and sent around, there was a request for input summary. Jared really did a fantastic job at pulling this together and putting some initial thoughts together. Jane and I had a discussion with him, which resulted in just some relatively minor edits, really. But I think it might be useful if, Jared, you're willing and able to kind of just give a high-level summary of what that is. And I believe the document's been posted for folks who are watching to the AOA website.
Okay, great. Let me just see if I can navigate to that so I can.
If it's helpful, I have a copy of it kind of up on my desktop. I could.
Oh, great. Yeah, if you don't mind sharing it, TJ, that would be great. So really, the intent here was there were a couple of pieces. The first was, you know, there were, as Jane sent, and over 15 responses to that RFI, and you know, I know, you know, different committee members have had different kind of capacity to read through those. So my goal in this first part was just, after having read through all of those responses, to try to identify and lift up some key themes for discussion about what I was noticing, and then what Jane and TJ were noticing. Kind of, we had a conversation about that, and then based on that, to basically say, what does that mean for some of the key considerations we want to be looking at for the draft design of the RFP. And so I'm happy to kind of walk through some of these. I also don't want to be kind of overly detailed or pedantic about this. I guess since there are folks on the call who probably haven't seen this document yet, it's probably helpful for me to walk through some of these points just briefly. Do you agree, TJ?
Yeah, thank you. I think that would be useful.
So that you see in this, at the beginning of this, there's the link to the original RFI. And so later on, you'll see a reference to questions or task numbers, and those relate back to the 8 questions or 8 tasks that were identified in the original RFI. And so basically what kind of I proposed, and what TJ and Jane have provided feedback on, is a very similar list of tasks for the RFP, but with added detail and or a slightly different order or organization that kind of flows maybe a little bit better and keeps things that are connected to each other more connected in a task list. So overall, it's, at least in the draft now, moving from 8 separate high-level tasks to a smaller number of 5 high-level tasks, but with more subtasks listed underneath. I think is the fair way to say the kind of where things ended up. And so specifically, you know, it's also a question of emphasis in terms of our the short timeline, and kind of wanting to be really efficient and careful with resources. There was a question, or a task number 4 in the original RFI, about technology, identifying technology gaps. My sense, I think others agreed, was that those are fairly well characterized already, at least in the short term. The longer term technology gaps out to 2050 are not something we necessarily need to be concerned with right away. This follows a kind of broader recommendation later on that we really frame this RFP with an increased level of specificity and analysis and kind of, I should say, kind of deliverables related to the near-term requirements of 2025 and 2030, and not assume that we're going to have a fully fleshed out and detailed climate action plan going out to 2050, given a lot of the uncertainty there. It's trying to connect some of the pieces of policy modeling together, and it's similar to what Council Member Cowart, who's co-chair of Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, said on Monday as well, just specifying, and I don't believe this was the original intent anyway, but specifying that it probably does not make sense for Vermont to independently try to assess a social cost of carbon separate from the very robust national and international efforts that have been made to do so, but rather have a literature review that frames up some of those choices, including the the value-driven choices about some of the key items like the discount rate, which can have big effects on what that end value is. So I think that's most of that section, TJ. If you want to scroll down, this also really builds on what TJ's presentation from the Climate Council on Monday, and in previous presentations to this committee about the plan for the comprehensive energy plan and the modeling that is being done by Stockholm Environment Institute and NESCOM using the LEAP model, and really not trying to duplicate that, but build on that. So, I think that it was a really interesting set of RFI respondents. On the one hand, there were some who either could or said they could basically complete all the tasks that were identified in the RFI. There are others who had a really specific expertise in, some or all of them, and either could lead a team or be a part of a team. And so you'll see later on a recommendation that to the extent that we would welcome proposals from teams of consultants, that it's clear what their roles and that we ask them to be clear about their roles and responsibilities if they're proposing that type of kind of team or lead consultant with supporting consultants type role. And then also, I suggested, I think Jane and TJ agreed that given the time frame that we are on, and that we want to be drawing on the knowledge and best practices that have been emerging in kind of peer states going through similar processes in compliance with a Global Warming Solutions Act type law or a carbon cap, that and that of course there are provinces in Canada and countries elsewhere that are doing the very same type of planning to meet an emissions reduction target and other key considerations around not just what you get to in terms of an emissions figure, but how you get there, and the very important concerns around equity and other health impacts, et cetera. That the extent to which we can work with someone who has already done this type of analysis for a sub-national jurisdiction would that, and there's some discussion later on, is that a requirement or is that a strongly preferred? I think we at least have, Jane and TJ and I had consensus that it was a strongly preferred thing, so that we could draw on that knowledge and expertise and have a better chance of hitting the ground running. So I think that's it up there. And then I'll say a lot of these RFP design recommendations are really thanks to the great input and wisdom of Christine Donovan, who's a member of the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, and she used to lead the consulting division at the EIC before she retired. And so this is based on her decades of experience of, what makes for a good RFP, both from the perspective of the agency that's issuing it and in terms of what some of the respondents are looking for. And so, this is about a clear statement of work, about explicitly identified tasks, which is basically the standard practice for state of Vermont RFPs anyway, but is helpful to just highlight. And then so in here, this basically is most of what was in the original RFP, just with a little bit different order and emphasis. I don't think that there's any, except for some added specificity on the type of things we'd be looking for around, say, the carbon budget development or the emissions inventory review. I don't think that there's really much that's new here. It's just additional detail is my sense. And I should also say, and Jane may want to speak more to this, that this is because I'm sitting on the Science and Data Subcommittee and the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee. The reference point that was closest, that was the most front of mind for me, was the tasks in the charges and work plans of those two subcommittees. And there may be kind of technical consulting needs that are emerging for the other subcommittees that aren't adequately captured here, but that may need to either be added to this or be kind of broken out as separate services to be contracted for in a later or different process. I mean, there's not a lot here around like the resilience and some of the mapping tasks that they have identified. I don't know if Jane, you want to speak to that.
No, I mean, I think you captured that well, Jared, and I echoed that at the council meeting the other day, that the RFI originally was comprised around components really helping us meet our greenhouse gas reduction targets. And so maybe Secretary Moore wants to speak to this now also, but I just reiterate that I think we'll have to do some sort of recognition that at some point the other subcommittee might be putting up and speaking loud and clear about other technical service contracts that they need. And my feeling is that we should act and move on these components now and sort of suss out what's left after.
Yeah, that Jane very much aligns with the points I had wanted to make, which is really the sort of the legal requirements and our obligations around the climate action plan are explicitly tied to the greenhouse gas emissions reductions requirements. And so to the extent there's this ongoing discussion about exactly what will be contained within the initial climate action plan that we are to produce by December 1st, I think we have more flexibility in some of these other spaces, and that flexibility, or perceived or real, is reflected in the scope of the RFI that was put out initially, with a great deal of emphasis placed on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. I think the one place to be clear, though, is in some ways we've highlighted it for ourselves already, is where those charges between subcommittees overlap. Mm-hmm. And in particular, the emissions questions that the Ag and Ecosystems Committee had raised in their charge, to make sure that they look at that particular piece of whatever we end up with for an RFP, and ensure, regardless of whether that work is falling under the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee or the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee, that they feel like it's adequately addressing the questions that they're hoping to have, or providing the information they're hoping to have access to on the back end.
Great. Yeah, I think that all makes sense. I actually raised my hand here, even though I've been kind of being traffic cop, because I wanted to add something substantive. Is that one area that is a little new here, I think, is this part in B, and this was talked about at the council a little bit, but not sure that this was in the RFI, and the priority on the near term seems to be something that's emerging as a new focus of potentially the council or potentially this committee. It's not clear. There's been no votes on it or anything like that. But so I just wanted to highlight that for folks, because that wasn't necessarily in the statute, I don't think, or elsewhere, and it's something that folks might want to comment on.
TJ, I had actually made a note of that as Jared was going through his remarks, that I do think that making sure that we have clarity as a council about what the goals or requirements are that we're working to address as part through this RFP is going to be really important. We are I think, fortunate beneficiaries of some fairly significant resources right now. It's not to say that as our work progresses, there isn't an opportunity to go back to the legislature and seek additional funding. But we know what we have in hand and want to make sure that we're doing our level best to maximize what we're able to get out of that in service of both the near term work we need to do, but the medium term work we're also going to need to produce, understanding there may not be this level of resources available to us again. And so I think there is a balance and an important conversation to be had there. The other piece, I guess, that concerns me would be to the extent we get sort of increasing or decreasing maybe levels of detail as we go out in time, appreciating kind of the practicality of that. Does that then wed us to a single consultant for all times for this work? And just making sure that whatever we get back, that we're mindful of to try to get it back in a form where, should we choose to go another direction 3 years from now, as we're looking in more detail at 2030 or whatever, in the next generation of the climate action plan, that we're able to fully build on. And I noticed, Jared, in a couple of places you'd flagged where folks had proprietary tools. And that's one that I think is really important, in that we need to set ourselves up for success, not only come December 1st of this year, but recognizing we're going to need to build another iteration of this plan December 1st, 4 years from now, and make sure that whatever tools and analyses are being conducted, they can be replicated and built upon in those future plans.
Yeah.
So do you want to, I'm not sure if you're done or not, Jared, but do you want to just continue, or if you had a comment back on that first?
Yeah, well, and I was just going to say that I want to be really clear that I think it's necessary that we add more detail around the specific deliverables under these tasks, but I didn't want to go too far down that path without A, having the broader committee having input on that, and B, making sure that we felt like these were the right tasks. Like, it doesn't make sense to refine the deliverables until we've got some clarity on the kind of tasks overall. But I think for each of these, it'll be like, what is the deliverable? Is it a model? Is it a memo with recommendations? Is it a PowerPoint presentation or whatever presentation to this subcommittee? I think that those will all have to be worked out. But at this point in time, it probably makes most sense to focus on these kind of task categories first. So the first one really deals with the inventory methodology and the carbon budget.
Jared, if you, sorry to interrupt, I just, Lou, you had your hand up, and I just wanted to, if there's something at that level that you wanted to address now, I think it would be a good time to do it.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I just, well, first of all, thank you for putting this together, Jared. This is great. I wanted to speak a little more about the blueprint strategy vision approach, which, I think seems appropriate. You mentioned that we really did not need to be looking into technology gap, which I agree with, and I just wanted to make sure that my thinking was aligning with this subcommittee, in that 2050, 30 years is impossible to predict what will happen by then. But that shouldn't preclude us, in my mind, from at least trying to define the vision in a way that adequately uses today's technologies with what we know about what is expected in the near term, to really flesh out what that vision would be. And so while it may be a vision, we can put specifics to it. I just wanted to see if that was what people had in mind.
Yeah, the way I think about that is that you have the vision and even a path to get there, but we articulate why that path works and what the key variables are along the way. And so that when we articulate those key variables, like say I don't know, rare earth minerals are no longer available, or costs are super high for lithium. So then we as a state, or the next climate action plan, can pivot away while still meeting the vision. It allows for flexibility in achieving that vision. So just like we don't want to be locked into one consultant over time, we don't want to be locked into one path over time, in order to kind of meet our targets in the way that's best for Vermonters.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, Jared, sorry to interrupt you before, but why don't you carry on?
Thanks, Lou. Agree with that comment. So this second section is really around. There's a whole bunch of analysis that is requested, from cost effectiveness to kind of macroeconomic, or as you've described it, TJ, econometric type analysis, health, secondary benefits analysis of the actual emissions reduction pathways. And there's been this language issue that I think we've all been trying to get clarity and use common definitions on about. I think we're loosely using the term pathways, but based on the RFI responses and our conversations to date, I think it's helpful to distinguish between two types of pathways. One are the actual emissions reduction pathways related to the sectoral targets and the kind of efficiency, technology, and behavioral measures that can result in those emissions reduction. Then there's this separate question of what policies, regulations, programs can achieve that level of sectoral change or technology adoption or behavioral change that adds up to that. But those aren't necessarily the same types of pathways analysis. And because both from EAN's technology pathways analysis and from the same analysis that the Public Service Department is doing for the Comprehensive Energy Plan, which are using the same publicly available state, federally peer-reviewed science derived kind of inputs and assumptions on things like emissions factors and known and proven technologies, et cetera, that we can then take that information and ask a consultant to build on that, or to take that information and model things like cost effectiveness. And if you can just scroll down, TJ, so that number 2 is at the top of the screen. Great. So, there's on the cost effectiveness question, this was kind of an open question. Is the path to build on a really good start at a cost effectiveness model that the Public Service Department has already developed, called the cost of carbon model? Or is it to develop something kind of separate or in addition to that? But this, really shows up throughout the statutory language for the Global Warming Solutions Act of cost-effective emissions reduction. And I would say that if we build on what exists, that model is currently just focused on carbon reductions. It's not focused on greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So that's only, about roughly 3/4 of the greenhouse gases. And it's really kind of it's not taking into account the full set of social and environmental externalities that might otherwise be included in a more kind of comprehensive or robust economic or cost effectiveness analysis that could include things like health impacts, et cetera, some of which a social cost of carbon gets at and is kind of nested under this task. I'm curious to hear what TJ has to say about this, but I think it is helpful to identify that we're going to need some models and analysis to help with these cost effectiveness considerations around different emissions reduction pathways.
Right. I was just going to add what the cost of carbon model that the department has done is, just for folks who may not be familiar with it, is As part of our annual energy report, we have looked back the last 2 years. So I think it's 2018 and then 2019 data on various clean energy or climate related mitigation measures. So you think specific measures like a heat pump transition or an electric vehicle, or net metering or an electric bus. So taking, or weatherization. So taking specific measures in across the spectrum of sectors, across sectors, and saying what are their costs and what are their benefits that on an economic piece. So a heat pump has additional electricity costs, but it also could you're reducing fuel costs, but you're adding electric costs. So just the net benefits associated with the measures, or net costs, and then putting it measuring how much carbon was saved in the year by the total measures, like all the electric vehicles, and saying this is the cost per unit of carbon saved. And so there's it doesn't get into this little paragraph on the screen talks about potential, doesn't talk about potential. It's nothing going forward. And as Jared said, it doesn't really talk about co-benefits at all, non-energy benefits associated with those measures. Weatherization, there's a lot of comfort, public health benefits. To the extent it's low income weatherization, there's a whole nother category of social benefits. And so those are excluded from that analysis. So it's really is a first cut at a pretty high level of what is the cost of carbon of our various programs. And I'll also just mention its program impact, which is potentially different than actual impact to the climate. And so there's another nuance there that needs to be fleshed out. But for better or worse, that's what it is. And I just wanted folks to have a sense of that. And as of now, we would probably plan to update it again in its current form, but we have an opportunity to perhaps make it better or do more with it through this process. So.
Okay, to go on to B, TJ.
TJ, I think you're muted.
Looks like I was on mute. At some point, I want to go back to reviewing the greenhouse gas inventory methodology, but we're in the midst of this little Roman numeral 2. Yeah. So why don't we keep going there?
So, and I'll try to be quick because I'm looking at the time, but I want folks to feel comfortable with this and be able to suggest additions. This section B on economic impact analysis, most of this language comes from a conversation I had with Ken. Ken is very popular on today's call, but he does a lot of this type of modeling for the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and these suggestions around looking at impacts on Vermont consumers, savings or costs, changes in disposable income, looking at impacts on the Vermont macroeconomy through lenses of gross state product, jobs, changes to state revenues. This all comes directly from his recommendations. And again, this would be based on those kind of sectoral technology measure pathways, not economic impact analysis of a specific policy mechanism to achieve that. It would be assuming we achieve those targets. What does that mean given what we know about or can project about cost savings, inflows and outflows of dollars to the state, et cetera. And then there's those other pieces of net effects on public health, which, economic analysis can be helpful to that, but is certainly not. I think there needs to be much more human ways that we understand that in terms of, whether it's. Oftentimes, I've seen analysis of weatherization that looks at deaths prevented, emergency room visits prevented, et cetera. But that would be part of it, as was identified in the previous RFI, as and then this last one, D, was also taken directly from the RFI that A&R wrote and issued. And then we get into kind of more of the policy pieces for 3 and 4. And then 5 is the kind of tracking and reporting framework, which is going to have to circle back to 1 about the inventory. You know, what we measure matters, and what we design for pathway reductions in policies is going to have to align with, you know, the tracking and reporting framework.
So the one thing I wanted to go back to, I'm going to scroll back up, is the Roman numeral 1 here, is to review the current greenhouse gas inventory methodology, et cetera, and just call out here that, you know, we Department of Environmental Conservation has a lot of experience with the current inventory, and there's probably a need to evaluate how much of this needs to go out to bid, as opposed to how much can be done in the near term, as in even in April, before we get bids back for this committee by DEC, the Air Quality Division. I'm not sure what that answer is right now, and I'm happy to hear from folks that may be on the line, but given the time, I might propose that that staff from DEC really just comment on this with Jane and myself, and perhaps Jared, and in the meantime, as we develop an RFP in the next steps, and then talk about it again next week.
DJ, are you looking for me to make a comment now?
If you want to, Bennett, yeah, you know, but I don't want to. It's kind of putting you on the spot, so I don't want to hold you necessarily to anything without really having thought about it. So,
yeah. I wasn't real. I was pretty much gonna say I wasn't prepared to comment.
Perfect. Well, then I think really just I wanted to call that out as a place where I think there is expertise, and just really want to get your engagement over the next several days as we look to develop an RFP, and then bring that back to the subcommittee next week.
Okay.
And
okay.
then this last part kind of references, or section D, I should say, references some of the learnings or themes that came out of the RFI review, in that, you know, we are suggesting that we would have strongly desire demonstrated success in being part of the completion of a climate action plan or its equivalent for a national or subnational jurisdiction. There were a number of respondents who've done kind of, you know, inventory work or climate action plan work for a municipality or a city, and to me that feels like a different, both a different scale and a very steep learning curve, just a different type of work. I mean, it could be related, but I think the extent to which we can work with folks who've done this work at the level we're doing it would be helpful. Again, given that the Public Service Department is already working with SEI and NESCOM on utilizing the LEAP platform, the extent to which somebody would be responding to say, we're going to build out analysis on top of those LEAP models, it would be very helpful that they have familiarity with and experience using that to avoid kind of steep learning curves again. And then this is really the Three is TJ's point, and one that Secretary Moore underlined, that we need to make sure that but for transparency and credibility purposes, that when someone asks a question, how did you arrive at that projection? The assumptions are clear and transparent, and they can answer that, and that this can be a tool that can be useful to us going forward without having to rely on a consultant being the only person who can operate or update the model. And that was a key factor for the Public Service Department in going out to bid on the comprehensive energy plan. And I think we all agree that we want to keep that criteria for this effort as well. And I have
Secretary Moore, you have your hand up on this one?
Yeah, I think it would be important to make sure that we're saying must be transparent, accessible to the public, I think is an important piece. And we may actually want to say, I'm assuming the LEAP model, TJ, isn't considered a proprietary model. Like, is it public? Like, is it a public? I'm mostly familiar on water side of things. Like, there are some public source models, right? Like SWIM is a product that EPA has developed, and they maintain it, but you can also pull it down and modify it yourself to do different things you may be interested in having that particular model do. Is LEAP the same thing, where you can actually get inside the code and people can look at that for themselves too?
So they can look at it all, but it's essentially read only, and you can't make changes.
But they can see how it's making its calculations, essentially, if someone was so inclined.
Yes.
Okay. Great.
I'll just note that one of the reasons that we liked it is because the licensing fee is really, really low for that as far as state government goes. And just full disclosure, it's not something, a licensing fee is probably not something a member of the public would want to pay for. It's not that low, but not like $30 or anything, but it's low enough that it's something that state government can still run and use. And it's because it was developed in partnership with either the EPA or the Department of Energy.
Okay. No, that's helpful. And so it may just be we want a couple of additional words there, recognizing this isn't yet anything we would push out publicly, but I just wanted to flag that. Sorry, thank you. And I have a comment on 4 too, but we can hold that till Jared finishes walking folks through, unless you were going to jump ahead.
That's basically it. I think it ends there with E and F, and I think E is both for our sake, clarity of roles and responsibilities, and for the consultant's sake. I mean, I think it was clear in the RFI that, and Julie or Jane, you'll know this language better than I do, that the point of contact, the manager, the holder of the contract will be ANR, but we also want to be clear about what the roles will be for subcommittee members and state staff from other agencies as well.
Yeah, and I think that's going to require some work. What we can't have is sort of a diffuse process for subcommittee and council members to be providing direction directly to the consultant, since we're the ones who are ultimately responsible for the budget. And so I agree. I think having that and probably making clear that direction will need to come from, I'm assuming Jane in her capacity as the director. And that way, if there are sort of requests that come in a side door, hopefully the consultant will recognize that they need to send them back through Jane to ensure that we're not asking for things we can't ultimately pay for. And I just, on D4, before we move on, wanted to note, I appreciate the idea of what's being captured here. I think specifically identifying proposed members, if we're talking about individual humans as opposed to firms, it gets really complicated. And just want to make sure we're all on the same page. If we're saying, if you're a team with 3 subcontractors, and maybe that's the way we need to refer to it. we want to understand the roles of the individual subcontractors, I think that's fine. But by the time you get down to the individual, it ends up being complicated if somebody should ever leave whatever firm they're with in the middle of our project.
Fully agree. That was the intent, and members was a vague or inappropriate.
Okay.
It was not meant to be individual people, members like of the consulting team in terms of other contractors,
Sure.
organizations, or so. Yeah.
Great.
And then I'd say the last two sentences in E, this goes back to the council conversation we had on Monday in terms of, working to identify kind of lead subcommittees in terms of who will be responsible for as we plan out our work plans, working on different pieces of this. And some of it is overlapping, like the carbon budget, I think, is an overlapping responsibility of members of both this committee and Ag and Ecosystems. But this was just an initial, attempt to identify which subcommittees would be most appropriate and interested in assisting with various tasks outlined. And I should say those tasks really refer to the ones in the initial RFI, those 8, not the kind of reordered and renumbered 5 Roman numerals we've just gone through.
Jared, is this as much for our own organizational purposes, that kind of drawing those connections, as opposed to anything we would be communicating to the consultants? I think we need to be fairly explicit that the consultant should only be taking direction from Jane.
Yeah, and this is kind of an odd memo because it's got some pieces that could be kind of edited to be included directly in an RFP, and some other pieces that are more for our consideration and discussion wouldn't show up there. So I agree with you on that. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Jared, for that overview and all the work that went into it. Are there other comments on the content before we get to process of the next step of what we might do with this? Okay. Hearing none. So as we discussed last week, the intent was to pull this together, get a summary of the RFI, how we might want to turn that into an RFP, and then after discussion today, to actually use this as a basis for actually developing the actual RFP. And so I think that, the main, she's walking away, so the main task there falls on Jane to develop.
It's a good time for her to leave the room, right?
Right. But I guess, Jane, what do you think is the timing for that?
My kids are really loud outside my door. That's why I knew I was going to have to talk, so I was prepping them to keep their voices down. So the timing for the RFP, I mean, I would love to give, Jared has done an excellent job of sort of getting the sort of what feels like the hit list articulated for the components of the RFP. But I would, the way that I had framed it for a timeline was that I would then take that information from that and today's meeting with you all and put out an RFP draft for everybody's consideration by Friday. And that's realistic if you all don't want time to consider what's been proposed. And I suspect, barring or recognizing that it's Q3, I would think that we would benefit from allowing some review from you all to consider if we have everything laid out there, and if you're in agreement, especially with those the components around the strongly desired and preferred considerations that would then be moved into how we would review and rank proposals, and that's something I would do. And perhaps it's just that by the end of the day on Monday, I agree to share that with you all, the RFP ahead of your meeting on Wednesday and the other meetings with subcommittees, and suggest that by Monday morning at 8, knowing that I have some substantive time on Monday that I could put into drafting the RFP, I say that by Monday morning, you all get me any feedback you have, and then I turn it around Monday during the day.
Jane,
That feels realistic if that supports all of you.
What's the best way to get feedback to you? Do you want us to mark up the document that was circulated, and then the next question is, was it? I think it was circulated as a PDF, but maybe I'm mistaken.
I think it's a Word document.
Okay, is it best for us to work in that and put comments and suggestions in there?
I think that would be ideal if that works for everybody. You could do track changes, or you could do comments on the side, and I could do my best to put them all together.
Okay.
And Jane, can you say a little bit more about what would be most helpful to you to get back? I mean, it feels like one thing would be if there is, first and foremost, if there's a missing task.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. I guess I would love, it's really that final section where we're getting at the tasks and deliverables, as well as the preferred and desired considerations for how we would review and rank the proposals. So that aspect of, have they completed a state climate action plan before? That kind of stuff would be really helpful for me also. And I would really focus the review there, and that barring any, like, I totally disagree with what has been laid out before and above, I would just focus the review below at that point, because that is going to be where I draw the information for the RFP.
And are you, just to play that out more, foreseeing,
Thank you.
you know, we'll discuss the RFP on next Wednesday, and then is one more opportunity to, once we see how it is and have discussion, to provide any more feedback?
Yeah, I think that would be great. Originally we had talked about the steering committee reviewing and approving it next Thursday, but I really think like Ag and Ecosystems doesn't meet till next Friday as a subcommittee. So I think we can discuss it as a steering committee, and hopefully propose a process to the steering committee that gives sort of perhaps this committee, this subcommittee, the authority to sort of work with me in partnership to approve the final RFP that could then go out after your meeting the next Wednesday, so 2 weeks from today. I can ask, counselors and people, Julie and Jared, who sit on the steering committee, if that feels like an appropriate. I mean, the steering committee blessing the RFP feels sort of out of line with perhaps their role, and I feel like it's A&R putting forward the RFP, and I think the best expertise we could be drawing on is that from this subcommittee. So it feels like, having a check-in with the steering committee next Thursday on behalf of the full council, but then recognizing that the final changes, if any, will come from the science and data subcommittee.
Yeah, I would agree with that approach.
Yeah, I think the only question I have is if in 2 weeks, I guess, time that this committee is kind of putting that final stamp of approval on it, but we don't necessarily know if I don't know, the Ag subcommittee has requested something or wanted something that is not ultimately in there. And I just, I'm a little hesitant to take that responsibility on as a committee where we could be totally, without our knowledge, ignoring something that from another committee.
Yeah, so I feel like since Ag and Ecosystems is meeting this week, cross sector is not meeting this week, so they're not. Yeah, I think we'll be okay because we'll go back and forth with the subcommittees as best we can, and we'll ensure that doesn't happen. I'll just say, and I should think about perhaps how, just to flag this for cross-sector, this memo, Jared, maybe we should just, and TJ, share this with cross-sector, recognizing that they're not meeting this week and that their role has been highlighted as just reviewing the RFP. Just make sure that there's nothing, a glaring omission that Commissioner Walk and Richard especially don't see right now. So I'll do that with them.
Okay, great. So the next item on the agenda was the work plan. We obviously don't have time for that. In terms
You
of
worked so hard on it today.
Well, that's all right. I'm a little relieved. I did start to pull together a draft today that I shared with Jane and Leslie Ann, that they didn't have much time to look at, and I think I could do another draft of that and share it with the committee in advance of next week's meeting, with some comments from particular folks. It takes into account a lot of what we're discussing today, those tasks and how they might slot in with review of consultants' work on some of these tasks that we went through today, and then some other ones as well. And so more to come on the work plan. I expect by Monday you'll have a document along with the RFP to look at, and hopefully we'll have time for it. And that goes to the topic of next meeting that I want to bring up. Is it seems like we have 20 minutes or a half an hour of process stuff every meeting, and I just want to quickly revisit, is this the best meeting structure of an hour and a half every week, or should we be we have a process where I think we need a meeting next week, but eventually should we be transitioning to a longer meeting bi-weekly, and some of the other committees are doing that approach. And maybe that question can't be answered till we see the work plan, but I just want to throw that out there as a possibility, because it seems like we just get started and then we need to stop. Richard.
Parkinson's law says that work expands to meet the time available. And you can usually get as much done in a 60-minute meeting as you can in a 90-minute meeting. And you can certainly get as much done in a 90-minute meeting as you can in a 2-hour meeting.
I thank you for that. And I actually use that when I talk with my staff all the time about the hour meetings that they like to set up for me. And I try and have it be a 15 or 30-minute meeting. I think that we're covering a lot of big, meaty topics in this committee. And so I appreciate that thought, and I guess that may be a vote for continuing on in this time frame, but I am concerned that we are cutting ourselves short on certain things.
I agree with you, TJ, that it makes sense to make that decision in the context of a work plan and figuring out how.
Okay. All right, great. Well, more to come on that then. We'll look at the work plan. We'll keep the current schedule as is, and until we collectively feel there's a need to change it. Well, I'll open up to members or staff first for any last words before we go to public comment. All right, hearing none, I'd like to open the floor to public comment. Mark.
Thanks, TJ. I really appreciate the work that Jared and others have done, and in my opinion, the GWSA's failure to establish targets for carbon uptake was one of the bill's major flaws. And in fact, one of the reasons that my organization urged the governor to veto the bill. So Jared's inclusion of sequestration and storage in the carbon budget is really important. And I hope that you can go even further and emphasize that that our ecosystems have importance that goes way beyond their value as carbon sinks. In fact, the most significant climate action that Vermont can take is the protection of her intact ecosystems. And I hope that in spite of the fact that the enabling legislation does not require that, that you will. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Steve Crowley.
Am I there?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thanks for this. Really appreciate the work you folks are doing. Appreciate what's in your RFI. I want to bring up a couple of points that are referring to some of the things you talked about today. One of the things I think that is worth keeping in mind is looking really carefully at the differences in the requirements for our current greenhouse gas inventory process and the IPC EPA protocols and all that, and what's required in the Global Warming Solutions Act. I think there are some important differences. I think one of the things they derive from is the 2-degree maximum temperature increase, which doesn't really, you know, the EPA and IPCC put up their protocols well before they figured out how important that carbon budget based temperature increase maximum was figured out. So the science, the systems haven't really caught up with the science, and so I think it's important to think about things like the timeliness of reductions. One of the sort of fuzzy points is how offsets and RECs figure in. I'm not sure that those things translate well at all from the previous renewable energy standard system that we have into the greenhouse gas accounting system. They're set on different fundamental definitions and principles and concepts. So I think I wasn't clear how distinct those two systems are in your RFI, and it might be worth thinking about that. So that's one point, albeit a little fuzzy, but I think it's worth looking at carefully. The second point is more of a longer term question, and since you raised the idea, Jared, of looking at vision for the future and those future targets, one of the things that is coming up, as I'm sure you know, is the nations of the world are pulling together their next round of nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. This year, they're coming up with that. And they're setting new 2035 goals. And I think it's a big gap for us not to have interim goals. I don't think it matters too much this year or next year or anything, but in the long run, I think that's, we know that's coming, and we might as well be prepared for that and I'm not sure what it takes. It might. I would think that in some future round of planning, those would become really important. So it's more than just the 2030 and 2050 goals. There's going to be a 2035 goal to work in as well. And so I'll just leave it at that. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Mark, for your comments today. Are there any other public comments out there? Hearing none, I'd like to thank everybody again for another productive meeting and your contributions today. And thank you again, Jared, for putting together and running through the document. Extremely helpful.
Well, I should say I feel a little odd that my name has come up a bunch because it was built on so much good thought and work that went into the initial RFI, and lots of great information that came in from the respondents. So really a huge team effort, and it's been great to work with you all on this. And I'm really feeling good and confident that some really important tasks are getting framed up that are going to allow us to succeed in our work together and the responsibilities that have been vested in us. So excited about that.
Right. Thank you all, and the council members, subcommittee members, members of the public. And I think we are adjourned.
Thanks, TJ.
Thank you all.
Take care. Yeah.